Hello and welcome. My name is Leah Kopke, and this is my 3D modeling podcast, Ambient 3D Animations. We are covering Pyro right now, and we're going through all the settings for Pyro. Everything from the scene settings to the Pyro output to the emitter tag and fuel tag inside of Cinema 4D. Today, we are going to be talking about the draw settings for Pyro, and you can find this within your simulation scene settings, either in your project settings or if you're using a simulation scene object. So let's go ahead and get started. So right now I have a cube in our scene and I have applied a Pyro emitter tag, which you can find under your simulation tags here. I'm using the default settings for right now, so that's really easy for you to see what I do on my viewport. And we have a Pyro output, and this Pyro output right now is using the scene settings within our project settings. So in here, if we scroll down to the bottom with the Pyro scene tab open, you'll see under the straw drop-down menu are a bunch of options. And we're going to go through what they do and how they work. The first thing to recognize is that if you have lines turned on, you aren't going to see this. You would need to either have garage shading turned on as your display mode, garage shading lines turned on as your display mode, quick shading, or quick shading lines, or constant shading. But you can't just have your lines turned on, because then you won't be able to preview this clearly. So I'll turn on garage shading. Now that I've done that, you can see that we have this draw Pyro option. We can turn this off and you'll see we're no longer seeing that nice preview of our simulation here. So draw Pyro will let you see this in your viewport. It doesn't affect rendering, it just affects your viewport. All these draw settings affect your viewport viewing for Pyro. If I turn this back on, we can see that. Do you see these green corners around the fire? Well, those green corners around the fire are showing the bounding box as it expands for the simulation. You can see as the fire gets larger, it also expands. So we can choose to draw the bounding box. Right now it's checked on so we can see it. If we don't want to see that, we can check it off. And now you can't see those green corners around the simulation. We could also turn on draw tree structure. Now in the last episode, we went over what a voxel tree is. If you want to know what a voxel tree is, we talk about that in the last episode. And then our next option here is the density multiplier. Now again, this does not affect what you see in your rendering, but it'll affect the opacity of the density in your viewport and how you preview it. So if you want to focus on just seeing this without the smoke or the density, you can turn this all the way down. If you want to see the smoke a little bit more, you can turn this up. So you have a lot of control over how you preview your density. You can adjust your draw quality. Now, the more you increase this, the more your computer may slow down, but the more accurate your preview will be in your viewport. So if I decrease this, you can see it's less detailed and it looks a little weird, but if I increase this all the way, it becomes very detailed and I get a much better preview of the Pyro simulation. By default, this is at about 75%, and honestly, that works fine most of the time. But if you want to see your simulation a little bit differently while you're working on it in the viewport, these tools are helpful here. You can adjust your emission scale. So if I take this down to 0, you can see it doesn't appear as bright or emissive. If I bring this all the way up, it becomes even more vibrant and more noticeable. I'm going to turn off the density for right now just so that we can preview this a little bit more. So it affects the brightness of your temperature being displayed within your viewport. So right now we have the temperature very bright, very vibrant in the viewport. You can make it less bright and vibrant in the viewport. Now it almost looks like smoke because it's so dark and gray. By default, it is at 1. So that's your emission scale. Your temperature scale affects how much the cooler areas glow compared to the hotter areas. So I'll increase this a little bit, and now the cooler areas are becoming brighter with this temperature scale increased. I can make the cooler and hotter areas become a little bit less bright if I decrease this. So you're controlling the brightness based on the temperature in here and how that's being previewed. I'm going to turn the density multiplier back to the default by right-clicking on this arrow. We can adjust the absorption coefficient. So this controls how the light transmits through the density. If we increase the absorption, it looks a little bit darker, more light is being absorbed. If we decrease this, it becomes lighter, less light is being absorbed, more of it's being reflected off, making it look lighter. I'm going to right-click on this arrow so that's set back to the default. We have this volume to draw option. Shaded is the default. It's what we're seeing right now. We can try density, and that will just only preview the density. Divergence lets you see the difference in density with a gradient. You can find that in here, divergence. The next option is temperature, and this allows you to view the temperature with a gradient. So you can see red is the highest temperature and blue is cooler, so you can visualize that here in your viewport if you'd like to. Fuel. Right now this doesn't have any fuel, so I'm going to add some fuel to our emitter tag. So I'll turn on our fuel, and now you can see a representation of how much fuel we have with the fuel settings in here. I'm going to start this back at the beginning. So that's our explosion with our fuel. We talk a little bit about what fuel is and how that works actually in the episode on the emitter tag and the fuel tag. So if you're interested in learning more about fuel and how that works, that's all there earlier. I'm going to turn off the fuel for right now. But it really adds that explosive look to the fire. I want to go back to look at our pyro scene settings in here so that we can go through some more of the options for volume to draw. If we turn on velocity, this will actually help you preview the movement or the direction that this is flowing. So red represents moving in the X direction, Y represents moving in, or green represents moving in the Y direction, and blue represents moving in the Z direction. And an easy way to remember this is by just looking at your axis here. You can see Y is green, blue is Z, X is red, and it's like that throughout Cinema 4D. So when you're viewing the velocity, the Y direction's green, blue is Z, red is X. So that makes it a little bit easier. Our next option is pressure. And this helps you visualize the pressure difference in the simulation. So red is high pressure, and you can see that it's moving up. So it's really interesting to be able to visualize these different parts of your animation, and they might help you figure out how your simulation will look once you render it out, if you prefer to preview in the viewport a little bit, rather than always having to rely on this IPR. It also can help you better understand the movement in your animation and how your adjustments to the settings are affecting the simulation itself. So it's a helpful tool, and I want to make sure to cover all of that in there. If you're interested in learning more of the Pyro scene settings or any of the other Pyro settings in here, please hit like and subscribe and ring the bell so you'll be notified when the next episode comes out. Thank you so much for taking the time to do some Pyro simulations with me.